Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. My name is Matthew Mellema, and I will tell you that me and the other folks at Anselm are super excited because our big Imagination Redeemed conference is coming up on September 24th and September 25th right here in Colorado Springs. If you are interested in coming to the conference, seriously, hop on our website and try to get tickets straight away because there aren't a whole lot left and they're going fast. To celebrate our upcoming conference, we're rebroadcasting some past talks from previous conferences that we thought were especially meaningful. And I thought the perfect one to start off with is one by Lanier Ivester back at our 2018 conference. For those of you who may not be familiar, Lanier Ivester is a writer / bookbinder / gardener / farmer based out of Atlanta. And she has such a great message here in this talk. She talks about the importance of home and uses as a launching off point everything from The Wind in the Willows to The Lord of the Rings to her own 19th century farmhouse that she lives with her husband in Atlanta. And to give you an idea of how much I love this talk, I was actually there in the audience for it back in 2018, and I still remember big chunks of it. It was just really sticky in a really good way, and I thought the message really hit home for me. So without any further ado, here is Lanier Ivester at the Imagination Redeemed 2018, and her talk is The Magic of Rivendell.
I want to begin by saying that this session can technically be classified as a workshop because Terry Moon, who's slipped out of the room, but when she comes back in, we'll give her, and her team of friends and ladies have done all the work. They're giving us a very lovely tactile experience of what I'm going to be talking about today, and I just think that's beautiful. She's really put a lot of love and effort into this. They're going to be serving your tea at your table, and I think there's some tea selections that you can choose from. So y'all enjoy that. Really, I think we could just sit here and sip our tea and reflect on the incredible hospitality that the Anselm Society has shown all of us and call it good. But I'm expected to deliver something useful. To begin, I'm going to read a selection to you from The Wind in the Willows. And I know this is not Rivendell yet. That's coming. But this is from Chapter 5, if you're familiar with The Wind in the Willows, which is, I think, one of the greatest books in the English language and probably one of the greatest children's books ever written. But this is midpoint in the book. It's Chapter 5, Dulce Domum, and this is Mole and Rat, who have already had a lot of adventures on the riverbank, and they're tramping back towards Rat's home on the riverbank. And it's a cold night in December. Once beyond the village, where the cottages ceased abruptly on either side of the road, they could smell through the darkness the friendly fields again, and they braced themselves to the last long stretch, the home stretch. The stretch we know is bound to end sometime in the rattle of the door latch, the sudden firelight, and the sight of familiar things greeting us as long-absent travelers from far over the sea. They plodded along steadily and silently, each of them thinking his own thoughts. The moles read a good deal on supper, as it was pitch dark, and it was all a strange country for him as far as he knew. And he was following obediently in the wake of the rat, leaving the guidance entirely to him. As for the rat, he was walking a little way ahead, as his habit was. His shoulders humped, his eyes fixed on a straight gray road in front of him, so he did not notice poor Mole, when suddenly the summons reached him and took him like an electric shock. We others, who have long lost the more subtle of the physical senses, have not even the proper terms to express an animal's intercommunications with his surroundings, living or otherwise, and have only the word smell, for instance, to include the whole range of delicate thrills which murmur in the nose of an animal day and night, summoning, warming, warning, inciting, repelling. It was one of those mysterious fairy calls from out of the void that suddenly reached Mole in the darkness, making him tingle through and through with its very familiar appeal, even while yet he could not clearly remember what it was. He stopped dead in his tracks, his nose searching hither and thither in his efforts to recapture the fine filament, the telegraphic current that had so strongly moved him. A moment he caught it again, and with it this time came recollection in the fullest flood. Home. That was what they meant, those caressing appeals, those soft touches wafted through the air, those invisible little hands pulling and tugging all one way. Why, it must be quite close by him at that moment, his old home that he'd hurriedly forsaken and never sought again, that day when he first found the river. And now it was sending out its scouts and its messengers to capture him and bring him in. Since his escape on that bright morning, he'd hardly given it a thought, so absorbed he'd been in his new life and all its pleasures, its surprises, its fresh, captivating experiences. Now, with the rush of old memories, how clearly it stood up before him in the darkness, shabby indeed, small and poorly furnished, and yet his, the home he had made for himself, the home he'd been so happy to get back to after his day's work. And the home had been happy with him too, evidently, and was missing him and wanted him back and was telling him so through his nose, sorrowfully, reproachfully, but with no bitterness or anger, only with plaintive reminder that it was there and wanted him. The call was clear, the summons was plain. He must obey it instantly and go. "Ratty," he called, full of joyful excitement. "Hold on, come back, I want you quick." How many of you have ever been homesick? Is that a silly question? I think everyone in this room knows what that feeling. How would you describe it? What are some of the ways that you would describe the feeling of homesickness? Aching? Longing?
Misunderstood.
Misunderstood. That's very good. Yes.
Untethered.
Oh, untethered. Did y'all hear that? We are living in a homesick world, and all the words that y'all have just used have described our human condition. Now, at the risk of sounding completely heretical, I am going to say that I'm not exactly talking about heaven. I don't think that we're homesick for heaven as much as we're homesick for Eden. We're not homesick for something we've never had. We're homesick for something that we've had and have lost, but of which we still have the broken splinters and shards in this world, and they are more precious than all the jewels and gold and treasures that this world could offer us. And our homes are one of those shards. As a culture and as a society, I really believe that we are homesick for our own homes. And I believe this is a core value, one of the core values, at the heart of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. One perhaps no character understood or exemplified better than Sam Gamgee. It's no accident that this epic 1,000-page adventure ends with Sam riding up to the front door of his own house. These are the last words in The Return of the King. Sam turned to Bywater and so came back up the hill as day was ending once more. And he went on, and there was yellow light and fire within, and the evening meal was ready, and he was expected. And Rose drew him in and set him on his lap and put little Eleanor on his lap, set him in his chair and put little Eleanor on his lap. He drew a deep breath. "Well, I'm back," he said. Throughout the series, Sam is the voice of comfort and stability, reassuring both us and his companions that all that ever mattered still matters and always will matter, and that it matters far more than any of us will ever dream. The Shire is a portrait of the England that Tolkien and his comrades fought so valiantly to protect in World War I, but it's also an image for all of us of home, in all of its comfort and complexity and beauty, the more beautiful because it's familiar. It's a beauty of belonging, of literally being the possession of place and people. And we all need to belong. It's one of our deepest and most primal requirements. And I would say that much, if not most, of the evil in this world is perpetuated out of the lack of belonging by men and women who have no real anchorage of people in place in this world. I also think that the "I'll fly away" mentality, that someday we're all going to sprout wings and shake the dust of this earth off our heels, has done great damage to our sense of belonging in the good place that God has given us. Of course we belong here. This earth was crafted exquisitely and with infinite wisdom and care to support human life. Why else are we not rolling around in a slime pit or vaporized instantly the minute sunlight hits our skin? Mankind was born in a garden, And ever since the fall, we've all been haunted with how beautiful it was and how perfectly its gifts and provision matched our human needs and propensities. But this world is still our home. Its gifts and provisions of flowers, freshly baked bread, laughter, friendship, starlight, champagne, wind in the treetops, a proper cup of tea, they're all still our birthright. And we needn't be shy to embrace the physical, tangible evidence of divine love that is at once utterly transcendent and endearingly practical. We've all been dowered with heavenly gifts which have been tempered down to suit our heavenly frame. And while we are indeed strangers and pilgrims seeking a better country, as Hebrews 11 reminds us, this doesn't mean that the version of that country we now inhabit is unworthy of our care or our respect or our love, or that its physical matter is somehow beneath the notice of the truly mature Christian. The counsel of Scripture and the historical teaching of the church is that this world is not destined for annihilation, but restoration. Not a brand new heavens and earth that we don't know anything about, but these heavens, this earth made new, redeemed, and restored. And that someday the glory that all creation is groaning for is going to be unveiled, and we're going to gasp and say, it was here all along. That all the broken pieces are going to be put back together, and all the remnants will be gathered, and the homeless will be at home. And this is why I believe that our very physical brick and mortar, wood, glass, steel homes, they matter to God and to the kingdom because they encase this holy gift of belonging, because they bear the grace of unconditional acceptance and practical affection to our homesick hearts. Jan Struther, in her wonderful book, Mrs. Miniver. Has anyone read Mrs. Miniver? Does anyone know? It's great. It's a series of wartime essays that highly recommended, but domestic essays from the English home front. But Jan Struther calls this kind of grace, she calls it eternity framed in domesticity. And I think this is a perfect description of all that home can be and is, for so much of this framing occurs without our knowledge or our intention. It's instinctual. But when knowledge and intention are brought to the table with instinct and custom, home becomes not just a memory or a reflection of Eden, but a glimpse of Eden itself. A beautiful fictional version of this type of glimpse is Rivendell, the last homely house east of the sea, or the first homely house if you're coming from the Misty Mountains. What does the word homely mean to you? It has pretty distinct connotations. What do you think of when you hear that word? Comfortable. Yes.
Simple.
Simple. Peaceful. Familiar. Yes. Yeah. Homely. Homely means like home. And according to Tolkien and the Silmarillion, the House of Elrond was a refuge for the weary and the repressed, a treasury of good counsel and wise lore. And from The Hobbit, Elrond's house was perfect, whether you liked food or sleep or work or storytelling or singing or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of them all. Evil things did not come into that valley. Homely means in this context, as y'all have already described, like home. Rivendell felt like home to each and everyone who came within its gates. It wasn't just an exotic vacation destination. It embodied everything that meant comfort and belonging and safety and beauty to residents and visitors alike. At Rivendell, Bilbo Baggins and his companions were healed of the weariness of the way and restored for the journey ahead. All of them, we learn from The Hobbit, the ponies as well, grew refreshed and strong in a few days there. Their clothes were mended as well as their bruises, their tempers and their hopes. Their bags were filled with food and provisions, light to carry but strong to bring them over the mountain passes. Their plans were improved with the best of advice. Much later, Frodo and his friends would find the same welcome, and his life would be saved by some of the healing arts that house was famous for. Healing and security, music and story, fellowship, nourishment, rest, counsel. Sounds like a perfect house to me. I'd like to propose that we look to Rivendell as an inspiration for the incarnational potential of our own very imperfect homes. So holding this image in the back of our minds as we explore some of the ways in which the sorrows and disappointments of this broken world point towards a native hope of redemption, and some of the ways in which our homes are like command centers of that hope. My husband and I live in a 19th century farmhouse, nestled implausibly enough on the northwest side of Metro Atlanta. And if you've ever been to Atlanta, you'll know how implausible that is. You'll know that as a city, it seems to be driven by the ambition to spread all the way to Birmingham and beyond. And then a small farm within its immediate vicinity is rare as hen's teeth. But our house has a lot of history. It was a field hospital during the Civil War and a working farm for well over a century. In almost 170 years, it's only been owned by 3 families. And of most significance to me, Philip and I had our wedding reception in the backyard, and we were married 19 years ago, and this was the house I came to as a bride, our only home that we've shared together. It's a simple Piedmont plain farmhouse, once common in our part of the world, and apart from the decorative flower-shaped vents cut into the gables, it has very few frills. It's imperfect, inconvenient at times, cold in the winter, subject to the relentless laws of entropy and decay, alarmingly so at times. Has anyone seen the movie Money Pit? We don't think that movie is very funny. And while any relationship with any house is going to bring its share of heartache and exhaustion, this house is our home in every sense of the word, and we love it dearly. Last May, our beloved, imperfect, stout-hearted old farmhouse caught fire. Now, I realize that in this part of the world, the threat of fire, the reality of fire, is a very painful reality that you live with. But under the mercy of God, Philip and I were at home when the fire broke out. The emergency responders were dispatched within minutes, the longest 5 minutes of my life, but minutes nonetheless. And our home was spared from burning completely to the ground. It was at once a thing we've always feared, living in an old house, and a miracle that we couldn't have imagined. Because one of the firefighters explained to us that our house is made of heart pine, old-growth heart pine timbers that are extremely dense, and that it takes a while for them to get going, to get burning. But once they do, they're like light or not. They go up. And that's kind of what we'd always imagined. So it's over pretty quick. But while the wood from the 1940s and the 1970s modifications was gone, those old heart pine bones remained, charred but resolutely intact. And there's a really strong metaphor for us in that. But all was not lost. But so very much was lost. My cookbooks and my teapots, my Christmas china, the collection of Georgian pewter that we'd lovingly gathered on our travels in England, and the little 19th century toy sheep that Philip had put in my Christmas stocking one year. One of our dogs. Our innocence of this particular brand of grief. The extent of the damage from fire, water, and smoke was so great that about a third of our house had to be taken down to the studs. All the ceilings had to come down, and a lot of the old plaster had to be torn out. Almost every scrap of original molding and trim, at least in the downstairs, some in the upstairs, had to be pried away. We tried to save as much as we could, but seeing as our house was obviously completely uninhabitable, our insurance company put us up, at our request, in a camper in the backyard. We needed to be on site for the sake of our animals. We have a small holding of pet goats and sheep and chickens and peacocks. And yes, peacocks can be pets, in case you're wondering. And we wanted to be on site to oversee the demolition and the restoration process, of course. And I remember sitting out in that little camper last summer, literally with my hands over my ears, trying to block out the awful rendings and groanings of the demolition process. It sounded to me like my house was crying out in agony. And it was an agony that had its echo in my own heart. For so much of the damage, and consequently the demolition, was centered into areas into which Philip and I had poured the utmost of our love and sweat equity. The beautiful floor-to-ceiling bookcases in the den, which Philip had built with a craftsman's care. The stained tongue-and-groove ceiling, which I had laboriously notched with a hand sander, board by board, because the heart pine V-groove was too expensive, so notched it myself. The checkerboard floor in the kitchen, which we'd whitewashed and painted together over Labor Day weekend early in our marriage. the William Morris wallpaper I'd splurged on, because the roses in its design absolutely sang to me of the divine grace always at work in our lives, transforming barrenness into beauty. It was horrible. And as I sat with that sorrow day after day, ensconced in an RV, in full view of my longed-for promised land, a strange and beautiful conviction started to dawn on me. Namely, that all grief is homesickness. All sorrow has its seat in the fact that this dear old broken and battered world of ours is not what it was, nor yet what it will be. And that all of creation is indeed groaning as in the pains of childbirth for the hope of redemption. Suddenly I saw it as never before, in the pickaxes and the sawzalls assaulting my home, in the sirens wailing along the 4-lane back of our property, in my valiant little goat, Hermione, limping along the fence line thanks to a rare parasite which we've been able to treat, but not before it had inflicted permanent nerve damage. This is not the way it's supposed to be. Our whole being wants to scream it in the face of sorrow and suffering and loss. My house and I were screaming it together during those long, wearisome days last summer. This is not the way it's supposed to be. 2 weeks after the fire, we got the news that Philip's dad had kidney cancer. I mean, of course it's not supposed to be this way. And I'm starting to believe that our very intimation of the way things ought to be is our token and pledge of ultimate restoration. That every lack we feel, every discrepancy between the way we instinctively know things ought to be and the way that they are, is evidence of a redemptive purpose working both forward and backward for our good. Why else would we rebel so violently when sorrow steals light or joy or beauty from us, if these aren't our rightful inheritance? We are wired for life, and we're wired to need a home and a family to encase that life and to seek them if we don't have them. The very fact that God sets the solitary in families is one of the tenderest proofs of divine concern for human need in all of Scripture. And God gives us homes that we might experience, not just intimate what it means to be at home in Him. So what does it mean to be at home in God? First of all, what does it mean to you to be at home? How would you define at-homeness? I mean, we've already talked about comfort and cozy, stability. I can't remember all the words that were used, but how would you define at-homeness?
Belonging.
Belonging, yes, thank you. Security, yes.
Fellowship.
Rest, fellowship.
Yourself.
Being yourself, yes.
Acceptance.
Warmth, acceptance. All of this is intended, God intended for us in our relationship with Him. Obviously, love, but we're reminded in Scripture that love is an active force, not word and tongue, but deed and truth. We serve a God at the infinitely practical and the hands-on. Shelter, safety, comfort, familiarity, being known. It's like how it feels when we come home from a long trip and someone has prepared our favorite meal. Or when you're staying with a friend who knows your taste so well, they serve you your favorite tea without even having to ask. All of these attributes have their original in all that God intended for in relationship with us. Remember in John 14, when Jesus tells his disciples that if anyone loves him, that person will obey his teachings, and that Jesus and his Father will come and make their home with them. I mean, think about that for a minute. The God of the universe stoops down to make his home with individual men and women. Now, if the incarnation indelibly dignified our humanity, then the fact that God Almighty wants to live with us in the very closest of familial bonds ought to and does dignify our very real, very imperfect, very physical dwelling spaces. And I'd like to circle back to the facet of belonging, which has been mentioned. Belonging comes from a remarkably uncorrupted Old English word that means not only to be the property of, but to go along with. And I picture this not merely in the static sense of complementing or suiting, but also in an active journeying sense. God's presence is our truest home, our homeliest home. And as we're journeying towards that ultimate destination, we're offered this tremendous opportunity to inhabit a world and a specific space within that world that's given to suit our need and our pleasure. After the fire, we received a tremendous outpouring of kindness and support and lots of messages, texts, emails, voicemails, what have you. It was so dear. And as overwhelmingly humbled and blessed as we were by the incredible warmth of God's people, there was this occasional theme recurring enough to kind of rub me raw emotionally. Over and over, people said to me, "This world is not our home." And while I know exactly what they meant, and I totally get the kindness and sympathy with which those words were spoken, something in me flinched and recoiled every single time I heard them. Something in me was shouting, "Oh, but it is. This good earth God gave to me was intended to be my home. This parcel of land on which this RV is parked, this charred ruin of a kitchen, this is my home. And even if it's not all that it will someday be, right now, today, this place is where I know and where I experience what it means to be at home in God." In her beautiful book, Roots and Sky, if anyone hasn't read that, drop everything and do. But Roots and Sky by Christy Purefoy, she writes, "We were never made for heaven. Our bodies, formed of dust, were always intended for a life on earth. This world is our home. The great promise has always been not that we would go and live with God, but that God would come to make his home with us. And because God has chosen to be at home with us, our physical spaces and the contents within them that serve to comfort or clothe or nourish or protect serve a sacred office, wondrous as any elven chalice or charger in Elrond's house. We must not set our hearts upon them as if they were treasure to hoard and grow hard around, but to shrug one's shoulders and say, it's all going to burn, I think is to walk past a low door into an abundantly redeemed life. There's an essentially Gnostic mindset abroad that negates and undermines our God-given capacity to experience unseen realities in practical and ordinary ways. As if a worn newel post or a patch of sunlight falling through wavy glass or a savory pot of soup simmering on the back burner were somehow less able to tell us how good God is and how cherished we are than a book or a sermon or even a conversation. But it's these very practical realities that speak to our hearts in a language that precedes language, in words beyond words, that allow us to touch and taste and smell and know the goodness of God. We are not disembodied spirits floating over the surface of life. We are human bodies with human needs. And when these needs are honored in practical ways, when we feel known and cared for and like we belong, our hearts are open and we're able to connect these tangible assurances with inarticulable realities. And this is where domesticity intersects with eternity. In the Old Testament, God's people were told to build houses and plant gardens during the Babylonian captivity. And I've always been struck by this because I don't think it was purely for expediency's sake. God didn't just want his people to survive this exile. He wanted them to thrive. He wanted them to flourish, to put down roots, and to burst into flower, because that is his way. And this image is particularly poignant and relevant to us today because we are living in an exile and a captivity of our own. We are home, but not at home. We're gloriously liberated and still subject to the laws of a broken planet. When Philip and I moved into our little camper last summer, I experienced the uniquely painful paradox of being homesick at home. It was just so hard to look out my window every day and see my real home just out of reach. It was so hard that I just wanted to put my head down and survive. And for the first time in my life, I really understood the connection between despair and squalor. We can laugh about it now. I think we can laugh about it. I'm not sure we can laugh about it. But the whole process was so overwhelming that there were whole days and weeks in which I just did not care. When dirty laundry piled up outside the camper. And if you know me, that's not normal. When stock pots and cat bowls languished in the yard because I simply could not process the steps that it would take to clean them. And if this sounds a lot like post-traumatic stress, let me assure you that it was. Let me also assure you that I addressed it with a professional. So But I have always taken a lot of comfort in an orderly environment. I've always believed that beauty will indeed save the world, simply because it slips past our defenses and pierces our hearts in ways that nothing else can. And not just the beauty of art or landscape or music, but the quotidian beauty of freshly ironed linens gracing a table set for guests, and a jug of flowers cut from the yard, and a tea tray lovingly laid with pretty china and silver spoons. But suddenly, I found myself wondering if any of it really mattered. Here we were facing a do-over on 18 years of work, beginning on things that we thought would outlive us, fighting for beauty and order amid chaos and ashes and dirty laundry. And the fact is that all of this could burn again. So what was the point? We named our little backyard encampment Camp Mara. Camp Mara for the last stop in the wilderness before the Israelites received manna. Mara, where the bitter waters were made sweet. After a few weeks, once the metaphorical smoke started to clear, another conviction started to materialize, one that I'd asserted blithely enough, but now had reason to test. And it was that all I've ever believed about beauty and order, all I believe about the sacred potential of home, was true in this camper, or it wasn't true anywhere. If we really believe that we're living in the now, but not yet, if the incarnation really did change everything, and if resurrection is not just a far-off misty ideal, but a living and active hope in our lives, then everything in our lives is valid material to image and symbolize and point to resurrection. Everything matters. And this is the inescapable and irresistible paradox that we're aching and yearning for something that's already ours. We're living on a down payment of something too good to be true. And when it's revealed, it'll be wilder than our wildest dreams and as comfortable and familiar as our own bed, our favorite meal, and the feel of our own kitchen floor under our feet. This was something we had to assert and affirm over and over again in our rebuild. Why we were so careful to call it a restoration and not a renovation. Because if this old world is indeed destined for redemption, the moments and the matter of everyday ordinary life is thrumming with the secret of it. So we have this vision of home as a kind of sacred womb for the cultivation and incarnation of things that we believe to be true. And we have this ideal of Rivendell as model and inspiration. So how does all of this translate into art and worship, as I promised in my session description? Well, first of all, I hope it goes without saying that the making and the keeping of a home ranks high among the creative endeavors. And I'm so happy that there's so many men here. This is not just a female occupation. So thanks, guys. The writer of Proverbs tells us that by wisdom a house is built. Through understanding it is established, and through knowledge its rooms are filled with rare and beautiful treasures. This sounds like the cultivation of an artistic craft to me. It also sounds like a lifelong pursuit. There's enormous creative potential within the realm of our homes, some quite obvious and some less so, but as Edith Schaefer reminds us in her wonderful book, The Hidden Art of Homemaking. Has anyone read that? Oh, I love that book. That shaped me so much. But as Edith Schaefer reminds us, and this is the first place I encountered this idea, we are all created in the image of a creator. There's no such thing as a creative person or a non-creative person, because as children of such a father, the world is our playground when it comes to material and opportunity for artistic expression, and it's everywhere in all of our lives. According to Schaefer, our whole environment is a canvas upon which we can articulate what we believe. And as Christians, we have this ever-increasing capacity as we mature in our relationship with God to respond creatively to all He has made. The Christian should have more vividly expressed creativity in his daily life, she writes, and more creative freedom, as well as the possibility of a continuing development in creative opportunities. It really is a wonderfully practical book, outlining various ways to integrate art into everyday life through ways like music, interior decorating, gardening, food, flower arrangements, even clothing, and to reflect the image of our Creator God in some of the most seemingly commonplace undertakings. I think that Edith would assert, for the Christian, there is no commonplace. Everything around us shimmers with incarnational potential, from a vase of flowers on a spread for a homeless person, to drawing pictures to illustrate sermon points for a child, to expressing ecology in our own garden plot or window box. Anyway, highly recommended, great book. One thing I think is important to mention is that throughout this book, Schaeffer makes absolutely no apology for the role and the validity of beauty. There's a psychological need met in surrounding oneself with beauty in the right way, she says. If you've been afraid that your love of beautiful flowers and the flickering flame of the candle is somehow less spiritual than living in starkness and ugliness, remember that he who created you to be creative gave you the things with which to make beauty and gave you the sensitivity to appreciate and respond to his creation. Now, we're living in an era in which beauty is suspect, dismissed by the world often as sentimental, unrealistic, otherwise irrelevant, and often disregarded by the church as indulgent or unspiritual. It's the same attitude that condemned Mary's anointing of Jesus' feet with a costly perfume. Perfume worth the whole year's wages, as Judas was very quick to point out. And yet this sacrificial act pleased Jesus so well that he declared it'd be recounted wherever the gospel was preached. That's really significant. Do you remember what he said in Mark 14? She has done a beautiful thing. Now, we're talking about physically anointing the feet of the King of Heaven, but I believe that whenever we bring the same kind of sacrificial intention into the world, whether on canvas or musical score or dinner table or bed tray for a sick child, that Jesus breathes the same blessing over us. You have done a beautiful thing. Beauty not only pleases God, it creates a very visceral reaction. And this is particularly true when we were talking about beauty in our domestic spaces. Of course, we don't have to be extravagant to bring beauty into our homes and our homemaking. I think it was Alexandra Stoddard in her revised version of Edith Wharton's On the Decoration of Houses. I think this is where it's from. But somebody said, I think it was her, said that the only really critical components for a beautiful room are fresh flowers, real candlelight, and real firelight. Now, we might not all have access to a real fireplace, but anyone can get their hands on candles and matches and flowers. But you don't get a lot of ambivalence where beauty is concerned, especially when it touches the basic daily physical needs of human beings. And I think one of the reasons for this is that beauty opens wounds. One of my best friends, she and her husband spent 20 years building their dream house in Australia in Victoria, overlooking like 2,000-acre sheep ranch, and vineyard. It's beautiful. But and they created intentionally as a place of retreat for other souls, and not only for their own family. But she told me they have just had so many people come in and just kind of explode and rant about why all this waste, in creating something beautiful. But beauty opens wounds. Beauty does pierce the heart, but this is not always a pleasant thing. Beauty can expose our lack and our loss for what never was, or for what was and is no more. And this can be extremely painful. But like T.S. Eliot's wounded surgeon plying the steel, beauty also heals wounds, affirming the infinite value of human life and calling us back to the beatitude we were made for. And even if we don't recognize the source of that ancient song that's inherent in beauty, it has its answering chord in every heart that ever has been and ever will be. In Elizabeth Goudge's novel, The Bird and the Tree, the disillusioned young David Eliot defines beauty as the evidence of things we believe but can't fully understand. And if beauty needs any justification, it's that. When the world has grown cold and the effort to believe in redemption is too great or has been abandoned altogether, beauty leaps upon us or steals upon us, dismantling our defenses, if only for a moment, and whispers to our hearts that redemption is a real thing and all the stories about it are true. Now, I've already mentioned in our rebuild journey that we constantly emphasize restoration over renovation, not only because we live in a historic home and we were seeking to save as much of the original elements as possible, but because restoration is such a core tenet of our faith. Our hope was not just a redemptive beauty out of metaphorical ashes, but a physical beauty out of these ashes, the ashes of our beloved home and the work of our hands. And I actually saved some of those ashes. I put them in a little box. And I needed to do that because that's how practical I want my faith to be. I want to be able to look back at that and see physically what God did. And there are so many things in my life which I can't see how God will ever make fruitful or beautiful. But ours is not the how. It's the yes. How many of you have seen A Room with a View or read the book? Love it. So good. But this is actually one instance where I like a scene in a movie better than the scene in the book, although I love the book. And if you've read it or you've seen it, you remember young George Emerson is constantly plagued by the dissonance between the world's beauties and the world's sorrows. He's made miserable by it. He can't even function in his life. And his father, Mr. Emerson, who in my mind is like kind of a sort of a mashup between Gandalf and Friar Tuck. I just think he's so cute. Mr. Emerson sees the budding romance between George and Miss Lucy Honeychurch, whom they met at a pensione in Italy, as antidote to his son's despair. In one of the most important conversations in the book and in the film, Mr. Emerson is trying to help Lucy unwind her very Victorian English primness enough to acknowledge the great, and I would say sacred, potential in this love. Make my boy think like us, he says. Make him realize that by the side of the everlasting why, there is a yes and a yes and a yes. And I love that scene, and I love it in the movie because the triplicate repetition, and emphasis, and Mr. Emerson's good humor just escalates to this trembling pathos, and it's just so beautiful. And I love it because as Christians, yes is our answer to the eternal why. We can look at death and disappointment and brokenness through the lens of the incarnation and the resurrection and say yes to the heart of God behind it all. But it's not a passive yes. It's an assent and a victory cry rolled into one. George and Lucy's yes to love was an active yes, staring down the everlasting why. And as believers, our effort to put material substance to what we believe is an active yes that resonates in the spiritual realm. Placemaking, the making and the keeping of a place on earth, is an active yes. It is, in the words of Wendell Berry, to practice resurrection, to be joyful though you have considered all the facts. And so Philip and I found ourselves in the midst of this enormous and exhausting process of reclaiming beauty and order out of chaos and destruction with no assurance that we'd ever seen the meaning in it all. And I learned something about restoration over those long, weary months. I learned that restoration is tedious. It's inconvenient. It's hard to find people who cooperate with you in it when it's so much easier and cheaper just to rip everything out and start over again. Restoration can look a lot like a fool's errand, a titanic waste of time and energy, a backward perspective rather than a forward one. But we serve a God who restores, who gives back years that locusts have eaten, who trades us beauty for our ashes, who at enormous pain and personal expense went back and undid the horrible thing that separated us from him. I'm a writer, and over the course of the past year, I've chafed at the fact that I had neither the time nor the emotional capacity to write the way that I wanted to. This disaster interrupted me in the middle of a project that I was really excited about and put a lot of my ambitions and my desires on hold, and this made me really sad. I was really sad about a lot of things. But one afternoon, a couple months ago, we were kind of not really nearing the end, but getting close. But I was sitting in my den, and the bookcases had been rebuilt, and I was painting these roses on, I had this wooden motto over our bookcase, and the motto actually survived. The bookcases had to be dismantled and didn't survive, but the motto, amazingly enough, did. I was able to touch it up and repaint it and actually reuse the original wood. But on this banner over the bookcase is this motto, which is my life verse, and it comes from the book of Isaiah. And it says, "The wilderness shall blossom as the rose." And what that means to me is that God is always working to make the barren places beautiful in our lives. As Sam Gamgee would say, to make all the sad things come untrue. Now, I am not a painter, In fact, I was just trying to replicate the roses in my William Morris wallpaper on this motto, and it was actually turning out better than I expected it to for a change. And as I worked, my mind and my heart were just suffused with this quiet happiness. I would even call it delight. It was something that I had not experienced since the fire. And with it came the even quieter but bone-deep assurance that this delight of mine was something of the delight God experienced at creation. That this pleasure was a tiny, faint little echo of the "it is good" that reverberated throughout the heavens and the earth at the end of each creation day. And as artists made in God's image, we're only copyists and translators of original art, just like my roses. But that does not diminish the joy that is our rightful inheritance. I would even say it takes a lot of the pressure off. And as I sat with that joy, which had been such a stranger to me over all these months, another idea came like a benediction. And I think we all recognize the whisper of God's Spirit in our inmost consciousness. Even if we can't explain it, we know it. It's kind of a language we speak among us that, God said this to me, and okay, he did. But the whisper that I heard that I knew was from God that day was this: this is the most creative thing you've ever done. Not painting these roses, but the larger work that this smaller task was a part of. And I thought back over all those hard months, the nail-biting decisions about window and door and lighting placement, and the interminable spec sheets, and the paralyzing inadequacy, and the sudden breakthrough of the elegant solution. The intuition, like a chord, finally resolved in an instrument that was finally in tune, over wallpaper and paint colors and casement hardware. And in a flash, I saw all these things gathering towards a crescendo of fulfillment, of solid ground out of the formless and void, of beauty out of ashes, of life out of death. Now, I don't know if there's a specific moment when the art making of a Christian crosses the bridge over into worship, but if there is one, I think that this might be it, when the pull of the world and the weight of our own self-consciousness just fall away, and we just sit before God, instinctively imitating our Father, bearing some tangible evidence into the world of things that always have been and always will be. Now, when we talk about homemaking and hospitality, it tends to summon associations of Martha Stewart's impeccable interiors and do-it-all image. But in Martha's defense, I'd like to acknowledge that for all her foibles and white-collar shenanigans, that she has done this generation a great good in restoring a sense of dignity to the care and the keeping of a home, and encountering the casual spirit of the age with a case for extra care in our surroundings. When we bring someone into our home, we have the inestimable privilege of caring for a soul that lives in a body. Souls need beauty. Souls need to feel that they're worth extra care. They need security and nourishing meals and firelight and good books and music made and enjoyed. I would argue that souls need fresh flowers because we're all homesick for a garden. And they need healing and counsel and prayer, all of which have their reflection in Elrond's good house, and all of which can have their realization in our own homely houses. One of the most beautiful things about Rivendell is that it's as much of a refuge for the elves who live there as it is for the wayfarers who find shelter within its gates. And this mirrors the Benedictine model of cloister and community, the ideal that the monastery, and in our case, the home, must be a haven for us before it can be a healing place for other people. That we and our families must truly belong before we can issue an invitation into that belonging. And that if we don't show compassion for ourselves and we don't create margin for rest and soul care and beauty, then we won't be able to offer people what they truly need when they come into our homes. And I think perhaps this helps us break down the difference between entertaining and hospitality. When we entertain someone, we feed their bodies, we give them a diversion, perhaps a beautiful memory, and all of these are good things. But when we show hospitality, we carve out a welcome for their souls. Hospitality is an invitation to touch, taste, and experience the goodness of God. It is to create, in the image of our Creator, all these little incarnations of His kindness and compassion for the human condition. But we have to make room for ourselves before we can make room for others. We have to allow ourselves to be on the receiving end of that divine affection. We have to believe that we really matter to God, and He doesn't look down on our humanity and our frailty, but that He is tenderly aware of our weakness and our need, and that He's eager to reveal His nature in every aspect of our lives. In closing, I'd like to mention something that a friend pointed out to me from the Chronicles of Narnia that I think is relevant to this discussion. Do you remember in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when Father Christmas arrived, doling out presents and treats and pots of tea, and how his appearance was evidence that Aslan was indeed on the move? And do you remember how angry the White Witch was when she came upon the animals, feasting and making merry? It was a world which, for all appearances, was her domain, a world in which it was to be always winter and never Christmas. She was angry. She retaliated. But the fact of the matter is this little wayside feast was an incarnational expression of reality. Aslan was on the move. And what my friend pointed out so beautifully was that this feast was, in the White Witch's estimation, an act of war, a physical stance against her limited and temporary rule. And the extrapolation for us is that every feast is an act of war. Every time we lay the ground for celebration and beauty and fellowship and nourishment, it's an act of defiance against darkness and death. It's a declaration that life wins, and that we believe in a God who redeems, who restores, who resurrects. Feasting is an active yes to the why of a broken world. And each of our homes, every home represented here, is a kingdom outpost. It's a bonfire in a dark valley. It's the rattle of the door latch, the sudden firelight, the sight of familiar things greeting us as long absent travelers from far overseas of our heavenly home.